to BookTrib Live, a Merrill Moss Media production. Today we are speaking with author, journalist, and human rights activist Rupert Isaacson. Rupert is the author of The Healing Land, The Wild Host, The Horse Boy, and most recently, The Long Ride Home. He's also the founder of the Horse Boy Foundation. Hi, Rupert. Thank you so much for joining us and being with us today, especially during National Autism Awareness Month, which is fantastic.
Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Let's talk quickly. So we've got The Long Ride Home right here. Let's talk a little bit about that and just maybe tell the viewers what happens in the book and the journey that you went on with your son, Rowan.
Okay, so some readers may already be familiar with me and some may not. So for the ones that are not, we recap what happened in The Horse Boy, where after my son was diagnosed with autism, he made this extraordinary connection with my neighbor's mare Betsy, which is so odd because I am actually a professional horse trainer and I'd stopped riding because I thought my son was not safe around horses, and I turned out to be completely wrong. And how we found speech, literacy, numeracy in the saddle together, and then eventually came to understand that it was certain rhythms, certain motions on the back of the horse that were causing this, and what the brain neurology was around it, and then how we could therefore generalize this away from horses onto play equipment and begin to homeschool this way and so on. And then how that's all very rational, and then how this non-rational thing also happened where, because I'm a human rights activist and I mostly work with hunting and gathering groups in Africa and had to bring a delegation from Africa to the United Nations the year that Rowan was diagnosed, how some of those people were shamans in their own culture, met Rowan, worked on him, got this great result. So I wanted to go somewhere that combined these two amazing things, the horse and this type of healing, and that was Mongolia. So we rode across Mongolia and came back with a kid that was still autistic, but had left his three key dysfunctions, his incontinence, his tantruming, and his inability to make friends behind him. However, the shaman of the reindeer people in Mongolia, who was the last shaman to work on Rowan, who got this amazing result, said to make the healing work, to fix it, to confirm it, you have to do 3 more journeys. And you'd have to come back to me, he said, because I realize I'm very difficult to find up there in southern Siberia. But you have contacts in Africa, etc., so you must do this. And indeed, the following year, Rowan did start to regress again and began to become incontinent again and go through these tantrums again. And we were thinking, oh shit, sorry, I have a potty mouth.
Okay.
This is, I guess, what was predicted. Okay, let's do it. So we went out to Namibia, to Southwest Africa, with the Bushmen hunter-gatherers there, who are the healers that I know personally, who had originally worked on Rowan in America at the UN. And then what came after that was this explosion in mathematics and other academics. And then the year after that, work took me to Australia. So I made contact with a really good Kuku Yalanji Aboriginal shaman in the Daintree rainforest in the tropical north. And 3 days of healings there, which were frankly mind-blowing, and we can return to that in a moment. And that one really challenged my sanity a little bit. And what resulted after that was what psychologists call theory of mind, where it becomes very clear that a child knows that you think different thoughts to them and have a different point of view, etc., which typically in autism either takes an awful long time or never arrives. And then the final year, we were on the Navajo reservation right here in the USA, and with this extraordinary Navajo healer called Blue Horse. And what happened after that was, for the first time, really proper conversation, like non-scripted conversation. Literally the day we were driving out of the Navajo reservation, we passed this McDonald's on I-40, and Rowan wanted to stop and get what he would call a fruity flavored drink, meaning it was full of red food dyes, and I didn't want to give it to him because I knew it would make his brain go bananas. And so he got grumpy and I got grumpy, and then I'm like, fine, be grumpy then, And he said, and from the back seat he goes, Dad, I'm not being grumpy. I'm just telling you what drink I want. And I had to pull over onto the shoulder. I said, who is this child? And it sort of blossomed from there. But the book also tells the story of, on the more rational side, how we then identified all the neurological effects of what was going on with the horse, and how we could then come up with a system of kinetic learning, first for homeschooling, and now actually that you can even use in classrooms. and now we collaborate with all these different universities worldwide doing this. So what I hope people get from it is that how the rational and the irrational can do and must live equally side by side to create quality of life.
Absolutely. So going back to what you got out of the Daintree experience, what exactly made that one kind of so pushing for you?
In the Daintree rainforest,
Yeah.
what I saw something that I still can't quite compute, which was when shamans are doing their thing, really good shamans and healers, there's no theater, right? There's no like, I am a shaman, and it's very sort of ordinary and matter of fact the way they go about it. Even if they're wearing costumes that you would find exotic or something like that, there's never this sort of sense of projected self or theatrics or anything like that. And in fact, it's usually a sign of a very bad healer or shaman when they do that. So this guy Harold is working on my son, and all he's doing is just sort of got his hands around my son's head, and he's sort of just doing this, and then flicking his hands, and he's wearing a t-shirt like me, and flicking a uh, a little ceramic tea mug, and me and Kristen, of course, we're sitting there, and we're curious, so we look in the mug, and we see that the mug is beginning to fill up with sort of viscous goo with little streaks of blood in it, like this,
Oh my God.
like bloody snot,
Right.
And we're looking at each other, and you've got to remember that Kristen, Rowan's mum, is a professor of developmental psychology at University of Texas. There's nothing woo-woo about that lady, and we're both looking at each other and going, what's going on? I don't know what's going on, and we see it sort of before us, sort of filling until it's about a quarter full, and then and we're looking like, is there some sort of sleight of hand going on? But he's completely bare, and he's not even touching Rowan's head, and there's no way you could hide anything. And then we ask him about it afterwards. He goes, oh, well, look, that's just what we do. But he won't explain. And then the following day we come back, and he does the same thing, and it fills up again, but not so much. And he said, I think we'll be fine by tomorrow. And indeed, the final day, there was maybe a droplet, and each time he just chucked it in the fire and behaved as if this was perfectly normal. And I've actually known quite a few people who've spent time in that tropical zone, because it's sort of related to Papua New Guinea. It's not far from Papua New Guinea, and up into Indonesia and places like that, describe very, very similar experiences with shamans and healers in that part of the world, because it's not something you see. You don't see that when you're in Mongolia or with the shamans of the Kalahari or that. You see different things. With the shamans of the Kalahari, you'll often see the Bushmen. You'll often see them taking on the pain of somebody else. So you'll often see them bleeding, spontaneously bleeding from the nose, the mouth, sometimes the eyes, and in terrible pain and vomiting great streams of mucus and that sort of thing, while they're sort of pulling stuff out of people. And then, on the Navajo reservation, what you'll tend to see is sickness manifest in patterns in ash, in the sacred fires that they make, which can be quite mind-blowing as well. But I hadn't seen anything where you sort of are apparently pulling something out of somebody else physically,
Right.
with no real sense of how you're getting that thing out, and you're not under hypnosis, and there's clearly no sleight of hand going on.
Right.
Yet there it is happening in front of your eyes, and it's just it defines the term mind blowing, yes, because
Absolutely.
your mind just doesn't really know how to compute it or take it in, but there it is, it's happening.
Wow, that's astounding. So the differences, let's talk a little bit about the horseboy method and the movement method. Are there differences, and what are they?
Okay, fine. So yes, horseboy method. When we worked out why it was working, we consulted with all these neurologists. Like, why was I getting speech and all this stuff on the horse in certain rhythms and not in others? And so we realized that this was something that we could reproduce, and we started working with other kids and found that yes, we could. And so it's an equine therapy approach specifically designed for neurocognitive stuff: autism, ADD, ADHD, PTSD, anxiety, depression, anything that's to do with the nervous system and the brain. Okay. And regular therapeutic riding is designed for physical disability, and it's very good for that. but wasn't developed for neurocognitive stuff. There wasn't the tsunami of neurocognitive stuff, 30 years ago that there is now. So Horseboy method is 6 things. You have to create the right environment, basically a natural environment. And the reason a natural environment is that there's no bad sensory triggers there. These things that can really shut people down who've got sensory issues, because sensory issues is the nervous system. So you don't want anything that's going to jar the nervous system. And there are some known bad things for this, like fluorescent strip lights or industrial noise and that sort of thing. So get rid of those. And the easiest way to do that is to go outside in nature. And by nature, I don't necessarily mean Mongolia or Yellowstone National Park. I mean a park, a backyard. And then you work directly on the sensory issues, body to body on the horse, on a horse that's not moving, literally lying on it, using it like a big old couch. And this calms the nervous system down immensely. Then you ride with the child in the same saddle, so that you're voicing the child's ear, not a challenging frontal gaze that they have to defend themselves from. You feed information in like NPR, and you give them deep pressure because your arm is around them. And then the motion of the horse, if you can train the horse correctly, you have to be a fairly good horse trainer and rider to do this. You rock the child's hips in rhythm through the motion of the horse in such a way that the child's body starts to produce large amounts of the feel-good and communication hormone, oxytocin. And oxytocin opens up the brain for learning. You stimulate the cerebellum, which produces something called Purkinje cells, which are the circuits within the brain that make the different parts of the brain talk to each other properly. Often a deficit with autism. Switches off the amygdala, the part of the brain that governs fight, flight, and freeze and stress, and engages the prefrontal cortex. This is this bit here, which is executive function. It's to do with reasoning, emotional regulation, and so on. And then also the vestibular system in the inner ear, which is to do with balance, but more importantly, attention. So then the child is suddenly in this optimal position to receive information, but much more importantly, to retain it, to keep it. Then we play perspective-taking games, which build the brain on horseback. And then from there, we segue into academics. We actually teach maths up there, and then we do it in French. And it's so easy, actually, once you know how. And then in the final stage, we get the child to begin teaching us what interests them. And they learn self-advocacy this way. And we can do this even with adults. And when someone is too big to share the saddle with us, we drive them in front of us in long range. But we get the same effects that way. Movement method is getting all those effects without a horse. So once we realized that we needed to get these certain effects on the brain through these hip rocking, balancing motions, we thought, well, we could do that, with other things, right? I could do that on my shoulders. I could do that on a swing. I could do that in a pool, on a trampoline. And we started looking into the science of kinesthetics and kinetic learning. And there's no controversy anymore now among the people in the science of education that movement is essential for the development of the brain. And there's a link here with dementia as well, which is rather like autism, one of the pandemics of our age, which didn't used to be. Putting old people in old people parking is a very bad idea. They should be running around after grandkids, moving, problem solving. And what you add with that is something called BDNF. BDNF stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which basically is a protein in the brain that acts like a miracle grow in the brain that makes your brain produce tons and tons and tons of neurons. So that's why, for example, if you are stumped about what to write and you go for a half-hour walk, you'll probably get the idea before you come back. So movement method incorporates all of the best of what we did with the horses, with play equipment outside, and then we do the whole K through 12 curriculum that way. And it's as good for general ed as it is for special ed. And we now consult with I actually just came from a school doing a consultation there. I'm here in Denver. We work with school districts, public and private, all over the country now. And both Horseboy method and movement method are in about 13 countries now, which we never would have imagined at the start.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it works.
So, how old is Rowan now, and what at this point, what changes have you seen since returning from these journeys that you went on, and where is he today?
Okay, well, he's 14, so the big change has been puberty.
Of course.
No, it's a fair change. He's bigger than me now. He is such a sweet, egoless individual, and smart and compassionate, um, humblingly so.
Wow.
And he has a web-based television show now, which
Really?
anyone who's watching this can, if you go to endangeroussafaris.com, so write the word dangerous, put an en on the front and safaris on the end, so it's two s's, .com, endangeroussafaris.com. It's ecology. He now takes over the journeys. So you'll see him tracking bears in Transylvania, in Eastern Europe, wolves in Yellowstone, orcas off the Pacific Northwest. It's ecology and toilet humor. Brilliant. And he's hilariously funny. And he's sort of a very functional autistic young man. He's still very autistic and he's totally functional. Think a young Temple Grandin, and you've sort of got Rowan.
Wow. Yeah, really inspiring. Um, how, why do you think the old practices weren't working? You talk about the horsefly method, the movement method. In what way do we really need these new practices, and why is everything that has been happening so far just not been working?
Well, for a very simple reason. The only reason why horseboy method and movement method are effective is because, remember, they weren't thought up by us. They were methods shown to us by autistic people.
Sorry.
I started consulting with Temple Grandin very, very early in my career, and a very successful adult autist. Then all the stuff with Rowan, I followed him. He showed me what to do, and then I began to figure out ways to introduce academic concepts the way he wanted them done. So none of this was a set of theories that we neurotypical people came in with. That's the difference between being effective and non-effective, because we're doing what comes straight from the horse's mouth. We then subsequently became curious and found out that there was science behind why it was working, but we were doing it long before we knew what the science was. And so the problem with a lot of the old methods is that were things thought up by academics, neurotypical academics, up to 30, 40, 50 years ago, particularly with behavioralism and so on, that really have nothing to do with the autistic mind. And it's very arrogant that none of these methods have ever allowed themselves to be adapted by the testimony. There's now an enormous corpus of testimony from adult autists who've gone through behavioralism, and that's all saying it was torture, I hated it, it was horrible. Like people who went through the English private school system, being beaten and that sort of thing. It's so coercive, it's all about compliance. Kids being locked in rooms, lots of punishment. Still coming from the old idea that reward and punishment is the way to go, that it's acceptable for kids to suffer. And I came out of a school system like that, and in the old days, people vehemently defended it, and now, of course, we know better. We know that we don't have to beat kids to make them learn, and so it's the same these gradual changes. But so the real difference between what we do and the more traditional approaches is that we are directed by adult autists and young adult autists at every level, and every time we want to develop the model, we go to those people and we say, how should we approach this? In fact, I just came from a consultation with a young autistic boy of 16 about how to start kinetically teaching computer coding. And he gave me a whole bunch of insights. And we consult with these people as paid consultants. We regard them as, they're professionals. These are not people who need our services so much. It's more, we need their help to figure out more effective learning methods for us all. And when you start taking that approach, it becomes collegial, it becomes a peer group, it becomes not like I'm God, you're a problem to be fixed and I'm going to fix you. No. So for those reasons, that's why it's effective. Yeah.
Wow.
Not because I thought it up. Because if I had thought it up, it would be very, very flawed.
Interesting. So true. So what is the single biggest obstacle that you've learned that is in the way of learning for anyone with an autistic brain or, as you said, ADD, ADHD, PTSD?
Usually it's the lack of physical movement. The idea of sitting at a desk and learning things, immobile, is not really how the human brain is designed. We're hunting and gathering apes. We're designed to move and problem solve. That's why we have this thing called BDNF that we produce in our brains when we do that. We didn't evolve these things for no reason. So it's always going to work best experientially. However, there is a certain number of people who can tolerate the stress of learning by sitting at a desk and so on, but there's many people who can't. And they tend to fall through the cracks. And a lot of them, however, go on to be very successful in life. There's lots of people who don't graduate high school and don't get degrees who, in fact, most really successful entrepreneurs drop out of the education system at some point. But there's also a lot of casualties, obviously. And so the single biggest impediment is the lack of physical movement while learning. Instead of saying, well, there's PE and sport, and then there's classroom time. And the people who are at the cutting edge of education in the world, high school education, we know where they are. There's the Scandinavian countries. And little by little, every year, they've been, in the last 5 or 6 years, reducing the amount of classroom time and teaching experientially maths, physics, everything in the forest or outside. And they're still leading in all those academic international rankings. And we are still at a status quo. So that tells us what we need to know. We need to learn from the people that are doing this effectively. So that is the single biggest impediment.
Okay.
That and the lack of compassion. If any teacher is coming from a point of view that somehow people or children should suffer a little bit in order to learn, then they shouldn't be doing their job.
Absolutely.
Because it's just not right.
So what can families who say they don't have access to horses, they don't have, access to the means to travel on these journeys that you took Rowan on, what can they do to help their children learn the best way possible?
So easy. Go outside. And we have put together a website with a whole bunch of kinetic learning resources on it called kidsmustmove.com. And pardon the dust on it. It's a constant work in process. And we now collaborate with some real leading specialists in this around the world. A guy called Professor Alfred Ziegler from the University of Osnabrück in Germany, who's a world-renowned physicist, and he helps us come up with all our math and science stuff. And then we can end up doing it with bunny rabbits, in a park, or ropes, or bits of string, or whatever, and calculate area and calculate pi and all this stuff, or statistics, So what I would suggest is, if people are looking for a resource today, right now, go to kidsmustmove.com and download our movement method courses 1 and 2, which they're easy to do. You can do them in about a day and a half, and really learn these 6 principles of kinetic learning and try out some of the exercises that we have. And then from there, you very quickly begin to get the ropes of what to do. And then use your imagination. Surprise us.
So it's called a spectrum for a reason, right? Because there's different levels of autism and severities. Is there any kind of research that says those at the lower spectrum do the best, or what about a parent who's saying, well, my child probably is worse than yours? What kind of advice do you have?
Well, remember how severe Rowan was at the beginning. Rowan was nonverbal, subject to these neurological firestorms, melting down tantrums all the time, self-harming, unable to make friends, only parallel play, that sort of thing. So he was pretty severe. It's easy to forget that. And so what we're talking about here is a continuum, not just a spectrum. So that means that you can improve massively over the course of your life, because the brain is very, very plastic. Remember that if you start to produce things like BDNF, you're going to actually grow your brain, and people recover from traumatic head injuries, strokes, this sort of thing, losing all their executive function, have to relearn everything from the get-go. And they do. I know a guy who that happened to, and the prognosis was that he was never even going to be able to feed himself again. And he ended up eventually restarting his law practice, 10 or 15 years after the accident. And so we know that this is possible, and in a way that we didn't 10 or 15 years ago. There's been a lot of research done here, and so the brain is relatively limitless in its capacity. So you must think of this as your starting point on the spectrum is where you start from, but it's definitely a continuum. But the more you feed the brain what it needs, the more it's going to do this. So the brain needs movement, the brain needs BDNF, but the brain also needs the right food, physical food. It needs blood, by the way, which is also movement, which is oxygen. But you may be familiar, I don't know if you're familiar with the anatomy of the gut-brain connection, but there's a nerve that goes from the brain down to your intestines called the vagal nerve. Actually, there's two of them. And the vagal nerves, when a lot of researchers now are beginning to realize why gut feelings work, for example, why intuition works. It's the vagal nerve at work. And that the gut and the brain are intimately connected. So you also want to make sure that your gut flora are okay. So take probiotics, eat probiotic food, eat some sauerkraut, eat the right kinds of yogurt, blah, blah. If you find that stuff disgusting, put it in a smoothie. I find that stuff disgusting, but I put it in a smoothie. Buy the really expensive probiotics that you have to refrigerate, that sort of thing. And really begin to change your internal environment, your internal biological environment as well. So you give the brain the food that it actually needs in the same way that you'd give your muscle the protein that it needs if you wanted to build muscle. That's all relatively simple to do. And take a long-term view. Don't panic that you want to fix everything in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. When you're dealing with a normal, quote unquote, normal neurotypical kid, you have no problem thinking in terms of a 20-year education. Think the same way. Because here's the thing, there's no problem to fix in autism. The autism itself is a perfectly valid way of going through life. When I'm working with Dr. Temple Grandin, I'm not going into her office and saying, I think I should fix you, Dr. Temple Grandin. I think Dr. Temple Grandin is fine as she is. She's a best-selling author. She sells way more books than I do. She's, a professor of animal sciences. She's got a whole career in the livestock industry, making things less stressful for animals there. So, but she's still very autistic when you hang out with her. She stims, she talks in loops, and yet she's totally successful. And so we should be looking for the gifts of autism and how to bring those out. What are the gifts? The near photographic memory, the often acutely active intellect, and the quiet ego. A lot of people on the spectrum have an ego, they don't have the sort of inner critic in their mind that always tells them they're shit, compared to everybody else. And, he's taller than me, faster than me, makes more money than me, she's thinner than me, more pretty than me, has a PhD, therefore I'm stuck, blah, 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 blah. And there's plenty of neurotypical people every day throwing themselves off bridges or disappearing down bottles. Being neurotypical is no holy grail, and a lot of autistic people have this very quiet ego. So being around them is very healing for people like us. So it raises the question, who's the therapist? Should we be paying these people $100 an hour to hang out with them? And when you go, probably the answer is probably yes, because when you go into indigenous societies, like Mongolia, like the Bushmen, etc., you generally notice that the people who are healers and shamans in those cultures exhibit neuropsychiatric symptoms, often to the degree where they might be institutionalized or certainly medicated in our culture. Think adult autism, schizophrenia, epilepsy, bipolar, etc. But there, it's regarded as a job qualification. This is interesting. And these people are very effective healers, even if you think that it's all woo-woo nonsense. The facts are that most of these people live an awful long way from Western medicine. They use it when they can, but they've got to use something else in the meantime. They get sick like anyone else, and they get better like this. So these are highly effective societies that cannot afford to waste human resources. We have been wasting our human resources for a long time. And if it's one child in 68 over the age of 8 and rising, which it appears to be, it's going to change how the workforce looks in 20 years, 30 years. So we want to be looking at the gifts. We want to be looking at brain plasticity. We want to be not trying to fix something that doesn't need fixing. We need to be working with something that's actually a bit of a genius thing.
Absolutely. So what are, you just touched on it a little bit there just now, but what are the connections, maybe the similarities to shamanism and Western medicine? Are there any connections? What have you found?
Yeah, surprisingly, it's very interesting. So my uncle, if you Google Dr. Peter Isaacson, you should Google him. My uncle was the head of pathology at University College Hospital in London, which is the equivalent to Johns Hopkins here. And he's a hard scientist who came up with a very effective form of treatment for a certain form of stomach cancer and so on. And when he saw the Horseboy movie, I expected him to take a giant shit all over me. And I even put up an imaginary umbrella. And I approached him at the end of the movie and said, okay, surf's up, do your worst.
Yep.
And he said, actually, Rupert, this time I'm not going to take a shit. And I talk about this in The Long Ride Home. I said, well, why not? And he said, well, because two things. One is you're saying that autism maybe isn't the end of the world, and that in it of itself is quite interesting. But he said the second thing is what you touched on is the irrational side of medicine. And I said, well, can you explain? And he said, yeah. He said, what we're talking about here is the placebo effect. And he said, most people misunderstand the placebo effect. They think they understand the placebo effect. They actually have no idea what it is. And they think it's a negative. They'll dismiss something as the placebo effect, which means that they fundamentally misunderstand it. So when drugs go on the market here, they have to go through a drug trial.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the control groups of people on that drug trial get given a placebo. And the drug, listen carefully here, the drug has to make more people better than the placebo, which means that a significant number of people, sometimes more, frequently more, as many drugs fail, frequently more people who were given the placebo get better than were given the drug. Now, these people don't think they get better and then go off and die later. They actually get better. And no one really knows why. We just know that clearly there's some link between empathy and the immune system and other things like that. But beyond that, it's guesswork. And maybe one day we will understand the science behind it. So he said, this is modern medicine actually rests on this bedrock. He said most people don't know this because they just go fill a prescription. They're not present at the drug trial. They don't see these people getting better through this irrational process. And I said, well, that's very interesting. So now what's quite interesting is when I'm looking for a shaman in an area that I don't know, I go through modern clinics. And what I mean by that is, and I talk about this in The Long Ride Home, when I found Harold, for example, in northern Queensland, I contacted a bunch of clinics, Western clinics in the native areas there, and said, do you have any kind of healer, shaman, traditional healer that comes on the wards? And almost invariably they said, yeah, we do actually. And we don't know what they do, but the people seem to get up and get better, so we're all about it. And the same names keep coming up. I then got curious. Outside of traditional native areas, are there healers and shamans on wards? You know where they have a shaman on the ward, in the children's ward? Take a guess.
I'm not sure. That's a big guess.
Johns Hopkins.
Really?
Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins.
Wow.
And the reason I found this out was because I was at a conference where I met a woman whose son was at Johns Hopkins, having had a traumatic head injury. She said, "Oh yeah, they have a traditional healer and shaman who comes on the wards." Can you imagine being at that board meeting at Johns Hopkins, going, "Well,
Right.
item number 37B, the shaman, where?" But they did, and these are cutting edge, leading medical scientists. So it's often only journalists and academics and people like that who take these hard and fast views on things because that's how they make their living. And I know this as a journalist, it's sort of part and parcel of what you do, and present something as fact, But the reality is that things are much, much, much more ambiguous, and that the people who are in the trenches of that work, i.e. the doctors in those wards or something, if they observe that something works, they'll follow it because that's the rational and reasonable thing to do, even if they can't explain why.
Wow, very interesting. Unfortunately, we're coming to a close here, but I do have a couple more questions for you. Talk a little. You mentioned Temple Grandin and that your time with her goes way back. What work are you doing with her right now to kind of encourage this kinetic learning?
Okay, well, she and I do some collaboration on curricula, what it is we'd like to teach and how to teach it. And then she and I are currently engaged on a joint speaking tour. We were just speaking in Denver a couple of nights ago. We'll be in San Francisco, I think, in September. We'll be in Fort Collins in Colorado in August. And we've got some other dates coming up. And I think we're going to unroll this over about the next 2 years or so, because it's a message that parents and educators and professionals need, is that there are some really, really, really simple, effective tools that anyone can do in their living room today, starting to put together obstacle courses of furniture and get over them, doing BDNF in the brain, and then start to talk about the physics of it, and then start to do that in French, etc., etc. And suddenly you realize, oh my gosh, actually, this is within the power of all of us to do. We don't need to rely on outside agencies to do this. And I think what she wants is to see more preparation of young adult autists for the workforce, and how that starts very early in life. So making sure that in the course of these curricula, we also have vocational stuff and the understanding of money, and the understanding of how to look after animals, because that turns into responsibility and timekeeping and that sort of thing up the line. And that these are things which are not addressed in schools, but we can address them in the family.
Now, I know we always talk about the challenges presented to the child that's autistic, but I think that many times we forget about the challenges that are presented to the family too. Can you talk a little bit about how maybe autism can pull families apart, and maybe any advice that you have for those families that are currently going through that?
Sure. Yes, 80% of autism marriages break up. My own did, except it didn't. Weirdly, Kristen and we both joke it's like breaking up saved our marriage. We still live on the same property. We are the best. We are best friends. We are literally best friends, and we realized at a certain point that we were beginning to kind of cannibalize each other, because we were the only two that really understood the complexities of what was going on. So we took our frustrations out on each other, which is very normal. At a certain point, we realized, well, what if we were to just split but stay together, like divorced but not divided, even though we're not actually divorced at all? And we thought, well, let's give that a go, and it saved the relationship. So it's confusing for people. So they will find us like watching Game of Thrones, having a glass of wine, rubbing each other's feet, but we're no longer romantically involved, and that gives us a certain freedom to have clarity with actually backing each other up and helping each other in the way that we need to, because we both have our eye on the common goal, which is Rowan, and then the greater work that we want to do. My advice is, if you're a family who's really feeling it, the strain, is lighten up on each other. Make it possible for each other to do things solo. Be each other's babysitter. Make sure that the other one can go out, and it's not just a night out with the boys or a night out with the girls, but really what are the things that you love to do. Make sure that you prioritize that in the family culture. Cover for each other, even if you're a bit passive aggressive when the other one gets home. Do it anyway. If you decide to split, even if you're cross with each other, keep your eye on the bigger picture, because 6 months will pass, a year will pass, you won't be cross with each other anymore. And don't do some act of violence against your family and break the children's hearts and all that when you really don't need to. The only people who are going to benefit from that are lawyers. You're going to be paying them. No need. No need. Remember, you're on the same side. But if you want to change the mechanism of the team, by all means do that. But stay on the same team. Remember, you're on the same team. And a sense of humor never goes, amiss. And it's hard to have a sense of humor when you're completely tired and broke and, haven't slept in 3 years, etc., etc. So try to cover for each other, to try and give each other the mechanisms for that. So you really do show that you're looking after each other's well-being. Listen to each other. And don't make staying together romantically the Holy Grail. Make staying on the same team the Holy Grail, and the rest will follow.
Interesting. Very great advice. So as we wrap up here, I guess my last question for you is, what are your hopes for Rowan, for the Horse Boy Foundation? What's kind of next? What do you look forward to?
Well, I think that where we're going is to create a universal, or be part of a movement, because there's many other people doing work like we're doing, to be part of that movement where we replace the old coercive models, where this type of behavioralism where kids are suffering needlessly, that sort of thing, with a more effective form of learning that is so universal that, say, in 5 years' time, people go, oh yeah, I know all about that, I can do that. That they don't think, oh, what is this thing? That people no longer panic when they get the diagnosis of autism, that they actually can see it as a good thing, that they know where the gifts are, that they know how to access those gifts, and that this is now common knowledge. I'd like to see that happen over the course of the next decade. And then I'd like to see that go out from the special needs community to the general ed community. And because the fact is, most kids in schools don't do as well as they could, and most of us, I was the same, don't thrive in that kind of learning environment. And now, as we know, that there are very simple tweaks you can make to classrooms to allow kids to move, as things as straightforward as balls, being able to go to yoga mats from a ball to a swing that's set up in the classroom. That's so you can still teach 30 kids in a class that way. These small things, putting forests into schools, putting lots and lots and lots and lots of plants into classrooms, that sort of thing. These are relatively easy things to do, but they make a huge difference into the ability of the brain to learn. It's about quality of life and happiness. So what I would love to do is just be part of the general movement towards greater happiness and greater effectiveness in our species. And I'm really honored to be at a front row seat with
Absolutely.
that. The best mentors on the planet
Well, we're at
who
the
are
end,
the
and
autists among us, and just continue to allow myself
yeah,
to be taught by
definitely.
them.
Yeah, I think we lost Rupert there for a minute, but I think he can hear me. I
I can
just
hear you.
wanted to
Yeah.
say, oh, good, okay. Thank you so much for joining us. This was enlightening and inspiring. And for anyone listening, if you have not picked it up yet or read it, The Long Ride Home, go grab it and give it a read. It's very inspiring and extraordinary story. Thank you so much, Rupert, for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a great honor.
Absolutely. And everyone, have a nice day. Thank you so much.